I heard her laugh before I even understood what she had done. A sharp, bright sound that didn't belong in a room filled with crystal glasses and white roses, and then her voice followed, light and careless. "Eat it, you old hag." As if it were a harmless joke, as if the 100 people around us would find it amusing. And for a moment no one moved, not the servers, not the guests, not even my own son standing 3 feet away in his tailored tuxedo, staring at anything but me. And I realized in that quiet, suspended second that this had not been an accident, not a clumsy misstep or a misunderstanding, but something carefully chosen, something meant to be seen, something meant to define me in front of everyone who mattered to them. I lifted my head slowly, the warmth from the buffet still clinging faintly to my skin, and reached for a linen napkin with steady hands, dabbing at my cheek as if I were simply adjusting my makeup, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, and the room remained silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, thick and uncomfortable, the kind that reveals more than any words ever could. 10 minutes earlier, everything had looked perfect, the kind of wedding you see in glossy magazines, held in a restored vineyard just outside Napa Valley, rows of white chairs facing a floral arch, a string quartet playing softly beneath the late afternoon sun, and I had stood near the back, watching guests arrive in designer dresses and pressed suits, each of them greeted warmly by Ashley, my daughter-in-law, who seemed to glide through the crowd with effortless grace, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, her smile polished and precise, and I remember thinking then that something about it felt rehearsed, too smooth, like a performance rather than a celebration, but I dismissed the thought, because I had spent years dismissing thoughts like that, choosing peace over confrontation, choosing silence over suspicion. When I checked in at the reception entrance, the young attendant hesitated for just a fraction of a second before handing me my place card, and I noticed the table number was farther back than I expected, tucked near the edge of the room, close to the service doors where the waitstaff moved in and out with trays and quiet urgency. And when I found my seat, I realized I was surrounded by people I didn't know, distant acquaintances, business contacts perhaps, but not family, not the people I had once believed I belonged among. And I told myself it didn't matter, that seating arrangements were complicated, that weddings were stressful, that I was overthinking things, because that is what I had trained myself to do over the years, to smooth over the small cuts before they had a chance to bleed. Ashley passed by my table once, her eyes flicking toward me for less than a second, her smile never faltering as she greeted someone else, and there was something in that glance, something cold and measuring, that lingered longer than it should have, but again I said nothing. I simply folded my hands in my lap and watched the evening unfold, watched my son laugh with his friends, watched the guests raise their glasses in celebration, watched a life that had once been built around me continue without even a trace of my presence. And then came the buffet, a lavish spread of carefully prepared dishes, each one arranged with meticulous attention to detail, the kind of presentation meant to impress, and I moved through the line quietly, taking only a small portion, not because I wasn't hungry, but because I had learned long ago how to take up less space, how to be less noticeable, how to exist without drawing attention. And I had just reached my table again when Ashley appeared beside me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to anyone watching, and she leaned in just close enough for me to catch the faint scent of her perfume, something expensive and sharp, and for a moment, I thought she might say something kind, something that would soften the distance I had felt all evening. But instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and then everything happened in a blur of movement and sound that ended with her laughter echoing through the room, bright and cutting, and the words that followed settling over the guests like a thin layer of frost. I finished wiping my face and placed the napkin carefully on the table, smoothing it out as if it were the most important task in the world. And when I looked up, I saw what I had perhaps always known but never allowed myself to fully acknowledge, that no one here was going to step forward, no one was going to correct her, no one was going to say my name with respect or even concern, because to them I was exactly what she had called me, something small, something inconvenient, something easily dismissed. And in that moment, standing in a room filled with people who had already decided who I was, I understood something with absolute clarity, something that settled deep and cold inside me, not as pain, but as recognition. And I realized that whatever happened next would not be about defending myself, or explaining anything or asking for understanding. It would be about something else entirely, something far quieter, far more deliberate, and far more permanent than anything they could imagine. No one came to check on me after that, not immediately, Not even after the music resumed, as if someone had simply pressed a button to continue the evening, and I remained standing beside my table for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because I did not know what to do, but because I wanted to understand what I was seeing, the way people avoided looking directly at me, the way conversations restarted in hushed tones, the way a few guests offered polite, distant smiles that carried no real warmth, only discomfort, and I realized that to them, the moment had already passed, already been categorized as something awkward but insignificant, something to be forgotten before dessert was served. I took my seat slowly and folded my hands in my lap, listening to the faint clink of silverware and glassware returning to normal, and across the room, I saw Daniel lean toward Ashley, his expression tight, not with anger, but with concern for her, his hand brushing lightly against her arm as if she were the one who needed reassurance, and she laughed again, softer this time, tilting her head toward him, whispering something I could not hear, and whatever she said seemed to ease him because he nodded, gave a small smile, and turned back to his guests, leaving the moment behind as easily as one might set aside an empty glass. I watched them for a long time, longer than I should have, because there is a particular clarity that comes when you stop expecting something different, when you stop waiting for someone to correct what is wrong, and instead, you begin to see them exactly as they are, without the softening filter of hope, and in that clarity, small details began to sharpen, things I had noticed before but never fully allowed myself to interpret, like the way Ashley had gradually taken control of every family gathering over the past 3 years, changing traditions under the guise of improvement, moving dinners to restaurants where I felt out of place, speaking for Daniel even when he was present, answering questions that were not directed at her, and Daniel, who used to insist on calling me every Sunday morning, who used to ask for my advice on the smallest decisions, had slowly grown quieter, more distant, his calls becoming shorter, less frequent, until they felt more like obligations than conversations. There had been other moments too, subtle but persistent, like the time I arrived at their home with a pie I had made from scratch, only to find that Ashley had already ordered dessert from a bakery and placed it at the center of the table, smiling sweetly as she thanked me and set my pie aside, untouched, or the holiday dinner where I was asked to bring nothing at all, only to discover that every other guest had contributed something meaningful, and I had been left with empty hands and a polite seat near the end of the table, close enough to participate, but far enough to be easily overlooked. At the time, I told myself these things were coincidences, differences in taste, generational gaps, anything that would allow me to preserve the idea of family as something stable and intact. But sitting there now, with the faint scent of food still lingering in the air and the echo of her laughter still sharp in my memory, I could see the pattern clearly, not as a series of isolated incidents but as a quiet, deliberate repositioning, a gradual shift that had moved me from the center of my own family to its outer edge without ever announcing itself directly. A server approached my table and asked if I would like something to drink, her voice gentle, her eyes briefly meeting mine before looking away, and I thanked her and requested a glass of water, not because I needed it, but because the simple act of asking and receiving something, however small, felt grounding, a reminder that I was still present, still capable of choosing, still aware. When she returned, I took a slow sip and set the glass down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if precision mattered, as if control could be restored through small, deliberate actions, and I noticed then that a few guests were beginning to glance in my direction again, curiosity replacing discomfort, their expressions shifting as whispers traveled quietly from one table to another, though I could not yet hear the words, only feel the change in atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable, like the first hint of a storm forming far off in the distance. I did not turn to follow their gaze, did not search for the source of their attention, because I understood instinctively that whatever was happening was not something I needed to chase. It was something that would arrive on its own, in its own time, and so I remained where I was, seated quietly at the edge of the room, my posture straight, my hands still, my expression calm, and for the first time that evening, I was no longer observing the room as someone hoping to belong, but as someone who had already stepped outside of it, someone who was simply waiting to see what would happen next. The shift in the room became clearer a few moments later, not through any announcement or dramatic interruption, but through a subtle ripple that moved from one table to another, as if an invisible thread had been pulled and everyone felt it at the same time. And I noticed a man near the front of the room, older, distinguished, the kind of presence that does not need to draw attention because it already commands it, standing very still with his glass untouched in his hand, his eyes fixed on me. with an intensity that felt entirely different from the glances I had been receiving all evening. Not dismissive, not curious, but searching, as though he were trying to reconcile two images that did not quite align. I did not recognize him immediately, and that in itself was not unusual, because time has a way of softening faces, of rearranging features until familiarity becomes something you feel rather than something you see. But there was something about the way he held himself, the way his expression shifted from uncertainty to something closer to realization, that stirred a faint echo in my memory, and I found myself holding his gaze for a fraction longer than I had intended, not out of challenge, but out of quiet acknowledgement, as if I too were waiting to see what he would do with what he had just understood. He took a step forward, then another, moving slowly through the tables with a deliberate calm that drew attention without effort, and conversations around him began to falter, voices lowering, heads turning in small increments until the movement of one man became the focus of an entire room, and I remained seated, my hands resting lightly on the table, my posture unchanged, because there was no need to adjust, no need to prepare, only the quiet certainty that whatever was unfolding had already begun long before this evening, long before this moment, and was simply choosing now to reveal itself. As he approached, I noticed the way a few guests straightened in their chairs, the way others exchanged quick glances, recognition passing between them in ways that had nothing to do with me yet somehow circled back to where I sat. And when he finally stopped at the edge of my table, there was a brief pause, the kind that stretches just enough to make every second feel intentional, and then he spoke my name, not loudly, not for the room, but clearly enough that those closest could hear it. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, and the sound of it, spoken with that particular tone of respect, seemed to settle into the space around us with a weight that had been absent all evening. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement, offering him a small, polite smile, the kind one gives an acquaintance from a distant chapter of life, and for a moment, neither of us said anything more, because sometimes recognition does not require explanation, it simply exists, fully formed, between two people who understand its significance, without needing to name it. He let out a quiet breath, almost a soft laugh of disbelief, and shook his head once, as if correcting himself for not seeing it sooner, and then he glanced briefly over his shoulder, not at me, but at the room, at the arrangement of tables, at the people who had just minutes ago continued their conversations as if nothing had happened, and when his gaze returned to me, there was something sharper in it now, something that suggested not just recognition, but awareness of context, of contrast, of the difference between what was visible and what was true. "I did not expect to see you here," he said, his voice still measured, still calm, but carrying a quiet emphasis that made the statement feel like more than a simple observation, and I considered my response carefully, not because I was unsure of what to say, but because I understood that words, once spoken in moments like this, have a way of shaping everything that follows, and so I chose simplicity. "Life has a way of bringing us to unexpected places," I replied, my tone even, my expression unchanged, and he studied me for a second longer before giving a small nod, as if that answer confirmed something he had already begun to suspect. Around us, the silence had deepened again, but this time it was different, no longer awkward or dismissive but attentive, the kind of silence that listens, that waits, that senses a shift without fully understanding it yet, and I could feel it spreading outward, table by table, guest by guest, until even those at the far end of the room had begun to notice that something was happening near the back, something that did not fit neatly into the script of a perfect evening. He straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture that suggested decision rather than hesitation, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of something like amusement in his eyes, not directed at me, but at the situation itself, as if he were witnessing a misunderstanding so profound that it bordered on the absurd. And then he spoke again, this time not just to me, but to the space around us, his voice carrying just enough to reach beyond our table. "Do they know who you are?" he asked, the question simple, almost casual, yet heavy with implication, and I did not answer immediately, not because I could not, but because I did not need to, because the answer, I realized, was already beginning to reveal itself in the shifting expressions, the straightening postures, the growing awareness that whatever had been assumed about me only moments ago was no longer sufficient, and I simply met his gaze with the same calm I had held all evening, allowing the silence to complete the thought for both of us. For a moment no one spoke, not even the man standing beside my table, because the question he had asked did not require an immediate answer, It required recognition, and recognition takes time, especially when it disrupts something people have already decided to believe. And I could see it happening in real time, the subtle shift in posture, the quiet recalculation behind polite expressions, the way a few guests leaned slightly closer to one another, whispering names, connections, fragments of information that had not seemed relevant before but now carried weight. The man beside me gave a small nod, as if confirming what he already knew, and then he turned just enough for his voice to carry beyond our table, not raised, not dramatic, but clear in a way that invited attention without demanding it. And he said, "Margaret Whitmore built Whitmore Holdings from nothing." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of silence, one that did not ignore, one that absorbed, and I watched as the first layer of confusion gave way to recognition among those who understood what that meant, because Whitmore Holdings was not a name that disappeared. It was a name that had simply stepped out of the spotlight, quietly, deliberately, years ago. I did not move, did not correct him, did not elaborate, because there was nothing to add that would make the truth more true, and across the room, I saw Daniel straighten slightly. His attention now fully fixed on us, his expression shifting from mild concern to something sharper, something closer to uncertainty, and Ashley, standing beside him, held her smile a fraction too long before it faltered, just enough to reveal that she had heard, that she was processing, that something in her understanding of the evening had begun to fracture. The man continued, his tone still measured, almost conversational. She stepped away after her husband passed, but the company never stopped growing. And this time there was a visible reaction, a ripple that moved through the guests more distinctly, because this was no longer a vague recognition, it was a statement of scale, of influence, of a presence that extended far beyond the walls of a vineyard reception, and I could see the shift in how people looked at me, not with warmth, not yet, but with awareness, with the careful attention people reserve for something they realize they have misunderstood. I folded my hands lightly on the table and allowed myself a slow breath, not out of nerves but out of habit, the same steady rhythm that had carried me through decades of decisions, negotiations, moments where saying less had always achieved more. And I thought briefly of the years after my husband passed, of the quiet mornings in a house that had once been full, of the deliberate choice to step back, to let others believe what they wanted, to live without the constant weight of expectation, and how easily that choice had been interpreted as absence, as irrelevance, as something small enough to dismiss. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her companion and whispered something I could not hear, but I saw the reaction, the widening of eyes, the quick glance in my direction, and then another, until the room was no longer pretending that nothing had happened, until the narrative of the evening had shifted entirely without a single raised voice. Daniel began to move toward us, slowly at first, as if uncertain whether he should interrupt, whether he understood enough to step in, and Ashley followed half a step behind, her posture still composed, but her gaze sharper now, more focused, as though she were searching for a way to regain control of something she could feel slipping, and I watched them approach with the same calm I had held all evening, because this was not a moment that required urgency, it required clarity, and clarity does not rush. When they reached the table, Daniel looked at me first, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and something else he had not yet named. "Mom," he said, the word hesitant, unfamiliar in his own mouth, as if he were trying it again after a long absence, and I met his gaze without anger, without accusation, simply present, simply aware, and in that moment I understood that what had changed was not just how the room saw me, but how he was beginning to see everything he thought he knew. Ashley spoke next, her voice light, almost amused, but there was a tightness beneath it now, a careful control that had not been there before. "I think there is some kind of misunderstanding," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the man beside me, then back to me, as if measuring the distance between what she had assumed and what she was now hearing, and I allowed a small, polite smile, not because I agreed, but because I did not need to argue, because misunderstandings have a way of correcting themselves when the truth is given enough space, and I simply said, "Is there?" My tone even, my posture unchanged, and for the first time that evening the question did not belong to them, it belonged to me. The air around the table felt different now, not heavier but sharper, as if every word carried more weight than it had just minutes ago, and Ashley's smile, though still in place, had lost its ease, becoming something tighter, something calculated, and I could see the way her eyes moved quickly from the man beside me to Daniel and then back to me, searching for control, for footing, for anything that would restore the version of reality she had been operating under all evening. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his hand hovering near the back of a chair as if he needed something solid to steady himself, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell me?" And there it was, not an accusation, not yet, but the beginning of something unraveling, the quiet realization that what he believed about me had been incomplete, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering, not with explanation, but with truth in its simplest form. "You never asked." And the words landed softly without force, but they did not need force because they carried something far more enduring than volume. They carried history. The man beside me let out a faint breath, almost approving, and then added, not to correct me, but to expand what had already been said. "Your mother was featured on the cover of Financial Review 3 times before most people in this room had their first job, and a few guests nearby shifted in their seats. The name of the publication clearly recognized, and I could feel the shift growing stronger now, no longer subtle, no longer uncertain, but defined, as if the room had collectively stepped across an invisible line." Ashley laughed lightly, though the sound did not quite reach her eyes. "That is impressive," she said, her tone hovering between polite and dismissive, as though she were testing whether she could still shape the narrative, still minimize what she did not yet fully understand. "But that was a long time ago, right?" And I turned my attention to her then, not sharply, not confrontationally, but fully, allowing her to see that I was no longer something in the background of her evening, no longer someone she could speak around or over, and I answered with the same calm I had maintained throughout. "The company posted its highest earnings last quarter," and I let the statement rest there, unadorned, unchallenged, because it did not require emphasis. A silence followed, brief but unmistakable, and this time it did not belong to me, it belonged to her, to the space where her assumptions had been, and I saw it in the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her posture adjusted just enough to reveal that something inside her had shifted. From confidence to calculation. Daniel looked between us, then back at me, and there was something in his expression now that had not been there before, something unsettled, something searching, as if he were trying to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman now being described in front of him. And I did not offer him guidance, did not soften the moment for him, because clarity, once it arrives, should not be diluted. Around us, the guests were no longer pretending to focus on their meals, their attention drawn openly now, conversations paused entirely as the reality of the situation unfolded piece by piece, and I could sense the questions forming in their minds, not spoken aloud but present nonetheless. How could someone they had barely noticed be someone of such significance? How could something so obvious have gone unrecognized for so long? And the answer, I understood, was not complicated, it was simply that I had allowed it. I had chosen quiet over visibility, presence over prominence, and in doing so, I had become easy to overlook. Ashley took a small step closer, her voice lowering slightly as if attempting to reclaim intimacy, to pull the moment back into something she could manage. "Margaret, if there has been any misunderstanding tonight, I am sure we can talk about it privately," she said, her tone smooth, practiced, but there was a new edge beneath it, something urgent, something aware, and I regarded her for a moment before responding, not rejecting her offer, not accepting it, but placing it exactly where it belonged. "There has not been a misunderstanding," I said, my voice steady, my posture unchanged. "There has been an assumption," and I let the distinction settle between us, clear and unyielding, because assumptions, unlike misunderstandings, do not occur by accident, they are chosen, reinforced, and ultimately revealed, and in that moment, standing in a room that had finally begun to see what had always been there, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by my decisions. Daniel's hand finally dropped from the back of the chair, but he did not sit. He remained standing there beside the table as if unsure whether he still belonged to the role he had been playing all evening, and I could see the shift happening inside him, not dramatic, not immediate, but steady, like something long ignored finally demanding to be acknowledged. And he looked at Ashley again, this time not with quiet support, but with a question he had not yet formed into words. Ashley noticed it too. I saw it in the way her shoulders tightened slightly, the way her expression sharpened for just a moment before she softened it again, and she reached for his arm in a familiar gesture, one that had always worked before, one that had guided conversations, decisions, entire dynamics without ever appearing forceful, but this time, he did not respond in the same way. His posture remained rigid, his attention divided, and that small difference, almost invisible to anyone else, carried more weight than anything said out loud. The man beside me stepped back just enough to give space, not retreating, but repositioning himself as an observer rather than a participant, and the room adjusted with him, the quiet focus shifting from explanation to consequence, because now that the truth had been introduced, what mattered was no longer what had happened, but what would be done with it. Ashley's voice came again, softer now, more measured. "Margaret, I think we should step outside and talk." And there was a subtle urgency beneath her words, a desire to contain the moment, to move it away from the eyes and ears that were no longer ignoring it, but I remained seated, my hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, and I looked at her with the same calm I had carried throughout the evening, because stepping outside would imply that this was something private, something small, something that could be corrected quietly, and it was not. "There is nothing that needs to be hidden," I said, my tone even, not raised, but clear enough that those closest could hear, and the effect was immediate, not in volume but in stillness, the kind of stillness that signals attention rather than avoidance. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had seen since he was a child, one that always appeared when he was trying to process something larger than he expected, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, less certain, more searching. "Ashley, what just happened?" And it was not an accusation, not yet, but it was no longer support either. It was a question directed at her rather than deflected away from her, and that alone shifted the balance in a way she could not ignore. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for him to notice, enough for the room to feel, and then she smiled again, though it came a beat too late. "It was a joke, Daniel, everyone was laughing," she said, her tone light, dismissive, attempting to shrink the moment back into something harmless, something forgettable, and I did not respond immediately. I did not need to, because the room itself had already answered her, the silence around us not agreeing, not supporting, simply existing in a way that made her explanation feel incomplete. Daniel looked around then, really looked, as if seeing the guests for the first time rather than as a backdrop to his own evening, and I watched the realization move across his face, subtle but unmistakable, as he registered the lack of laughter, the absence of ease, the way people avoided meeting his eyes now, rather than mine, and when his gaze returned to Ashley, there was something new in it, something that had not been there before, not anger, not yet, but awareness. I shifted slightly in my chair, not to draw attention but to mark the moment, to acknowledge the change that had already taken place, and I reached for my glass again, taking a small sip before setting it down with deliberate care, because control is often found in the smallest actions, in the quiet decisions that shape how a moment unfolds rather than how it is remembered. "Intent does not change impact," I said then, not to challenge her, but to state what was already evident, and the words did not need to be loud to carry. They settled into the space between us with a clarity that did not invite debate. Ashley's expression shifted again, the composure still there, but thinner now, stretched across something less stable, and she glanced briefly toward the guests, then back to Daniel, as if measuring what remained within her control, and I understood then that this was no longer about me, not entirely, it was about the structure she had built, the position she had maintained, and the way it was beginning to change in front of an audience that could no longer be guided as easily as before. Daniel straightened slightly, his shoulders pulling back in a way that suggested not confidence but decision, and though he had not yet spoken again, I could see it forming, the first real step away from the version of events he had accepted for so long, and I did not interrupt it, did not rush it, because some realizations once begun, carry themselves forward without assistance, and all that remains is to let them arrive fully, without interference, without noise, without the comfort of pretending that nothing has changed. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence stretched between him and Ashley felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, because it was no longer the silence of avoidance, it was the silence of recognition, and I could see it in the way his gaze lingered on her, not searching for reassurance this time, but for truth, and when she met his eyes, there was a brief flicker of something unguarded before she quickly replaced it with the same composed expression she had worn all evening. "It was nothing," she said again, softer now, as if repetition alone could make it believable, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried before, and Daniel did not nod, did not agree, he simply stood there, absorbing the moment in a way that suggested he was no longer willing to accept the easiest explanation. I remained still, watching without intervening, because this part did not belong to me, it belonged to them, to the space between what had been assumed and what was now undeniable, and around us, the guests had stopped pretending entirely, their attention openly fixed on our table, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a quiet understanding that something significant was unfolding, something that would define the rest of the evening in ways no one had anticipated. Ashley's posture shifted subtly, her shoulders drawing back as if she were preparing to reclaim control, and she let out a small breath, her tone sharpening just enough to re-establish authority. "Daniel, you are overthinking this," she said, her hand moving again toward his arm, but this time, he stepped slightly to the side, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but enough to create distance, and that single movement, quiet as it was, changed everything. I saw it in her expression, the momentary break in composure, the quick calculation behind her eyes as she reassessed the situation, because control, once disrupted, does not return easily, especially not in front of an audience that has already begun to question it. "No," Daniel said finally, his voice steady, not loud, but firm in a way I had not heard from him in years. "I am not overthinking," and he glanced briefly toward me before looking back at her. "I just did not see it before." And those words, simple as they were, carried a weight that settled into the room like a quiet verdict. Ashley's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to respond, but she paused, just long enough for the moment to slip out of her control, and I realized then that this was the first time she had been truly unprepared, the first time her usual confidence had not been enough to guide the narrative back into place. I reached for my napkin again, not because I needed it, but because the small, deliberate movement grounded me, a reminder that presence does not require performance, that strength can exist without display, and I placed it neatly beside my plate before looking up once more, meeting Daniel's gaze with the same calm I had held from the beginning. "Seeing clearly is not always comfortable," I said, my voice even, offering no accusation, no bitterness, only a statement. That required no defense, and he nodded slightly, almost instinctively, as if he understood that the discomfort he felt now was not something to avoid, but something to face. Ashley let out a quiet laugh then, though it carried none of the brightness it had earlier, and she straightened her posture, drawing herself up as if preparing for a different kind of conversation. "This is ridiculous," she said, her tone controlled, but edged now with something sharper, something less certain. "We are at our wedding, Daniel, and this is what we are doing." And there it was, the attempt to redirect, to minimize, to frame the moment as inappropriate rather than inevitable. But Daniel did not look away, did not retreat into the role he had played for so long, and I could see the shift settling into him, not as anger but as awareness, the kind that does not fade once it has taken hold. The man who had approached me earlier remained nearby, silent now, but attentive, his presence steady, and I sensed that he, like the others, understood that what was happening could not be undone, not by laughter, not by dismissal, not by a change of subject, because once a truth is spoken into a room, it alters everything within it, including the people who hear it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about witnessing what would follow. And as I watched my son stand there, no longer avoiding, no longer deferring, I understood that the evening had already changed in ways that could not be reversed, not by them, not by me, but by the simple fact that what had been hidden was now visible, and visibility, once granted, does not easily disappear. The room did not return to normal after that, it could not, because something had already shifted too far to be ignored, and even the music, still playing softly in the background, felt out of place now, like a performance continuing long after the audience had stopped believing in it. And I watched as Ashley's composure settled into something more rigid, more controlled, as if she had decided that if she could not reshape the moment, she would contain it, manage it, reduce it to something smaller than it truly was. "We are not doing this here," she said finally, her voice low but firm, directing the statement more toward Daniel than anyone else, as if trying to pull him back into alignment, back into the version of events she had constructed, and for a brief second, I saw hesitation in him, the old reflex, the familiar instinct to follow her lead, but it passed, not completely, not effortlessly, but enough. He looked at her, then at me, and something in his expression settled, not with certainty, but with decision. And I understood then that whatever he chose next would not come from habit, but from awareness. I rose from my chair slowly, not abruptly, not in response to her, but because the moment had reached its natural conclusion for me, and as I stood, a few heads turned more fully in my direction, the quiet attention of the room shifting once again, and I adjusted the sleeve of my jacket with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric as if I were preparing to leave a meeting rather than a family celebration, because in many ways that is exactly what this had become. Daniel took a small step toward me. "Mom, wait," he said, the word coming more easily this time, less hesitant, but still uncertain in its direction, and I paused, not turning immediately, giving the moment space to define itself before I responded. And when I did, I met his gaze without distance, without softness either, simply present. "You have a choice to make," I said, my voice steady, not instructing, not demanding, but clear in a way that did not invite misinterpretation, and he held my gaze, the weight of that statement settling into him, because it was not about the evening, not about what had just happened, but about everything that had led to it. Ashley stepped forward then, her tone sharpening again. "Daniel, this is not fair," she said, and there was a new urgency in her voice now, not the polished control from before, but something closer to strain, as if the structure she had relied on was no longer holding as firmly as it once had. "You are letting this get out of hand." And I did not look at her, not because I was avoiding her, but because she no longer needed to be the focus. Her position had already been defined by her actions, and nothing she said now would change that. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lifting and falling as if he were releasing something he had carried for longer than he realized, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but steadier. "No, it has been out of hand for a long time." And the words, simple as they were, seemed to echo further than anything spoken that evening, because they were not just a response, they were an acknowledgement, a recognition that extended beyond this moment into something deeper, something that could not be dismissed or reshaped. I inclined my head slightly, not in approval, not in encouragement, but in acknowledgement of what had just occurred, because clarity, once spoken, deserves to be recognized, even if it arrives late. The man who had first approached me gave a small nod as well, stepping back further now, allowing the space to belong fully to us, to the consequences that were unfolding without interference. And I took a single step away from the table. Then another, not hurried, not hesitant, simply moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had guided me through every decision of significance in my life. Behind me, I could hear Ashley speaking again, her voice lower, more urgent, words blending into the background without reaching me fully, and Daniel responding, his tone measured, no longer deflecting, no longer avoiding, and I did not turn back, not because I was indifferent, but because some moments do not require witnessing twice. They require acceptance, and as I walked toward the exit, the soft lights of the reception hall reflecting off polished surfaces, I felt no need to explain, no need to justify, only the steady awareness that the evening had already done what it was meant to do. It had revealed, it had clarified, it had shifted what could no longer remain hidden, and whatever followed would unfold from that truth, not from anything left unsaid. The evening air felt cooler as I stepped outside, the quiet stretching wide beyond the soft glow of the reception lights behind me, and for the first time since I had arrived, there was no noise pressing in from every direction, no music, no conversation, only the distant hum of the vineyard settling into the night, and I paused near the edge of the stone pathway, not because I was unsure of where to go, but because I understood that what had just ended was not simply an event, it was a chapter, one that had been closing slowly for years without my fully acknowledging it. I reached into my bag and took out my phone, the screen lighting up with a steady familiarity, and for a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of decisions that no longer required delay, no longer needed to be softened by patience or explained through compromise, and I scrolled briefly before selecting a contact that had remained untouched for some time, not forgotten but reserved, and when the call connected, I spoke with the same calm I had carried throughout the evening. "It is time," I said, and the voice on the other end did not ask for clarification, did not question the timing, only acknowledged with quiet understanding, because some instructions are not new, they are simply activated. Inside, through the tall windows, I could still see the movement of figures, the subtle shifts in posture and direction, and I imagined the conversations unfolding, the explanations forming and dissolving, the realization continuing to settle into a room that could no longer return to what it had been just hours before, and I felt no need to return to it, no need to witness the aftermath, because I had already seen what mattered, I had already heard what needed to be heard, and anything that followed would not change the clarity that had been reached. A few minutes later, the doors behind me opened, and I heard footsteps approach, measured but uncertain, and I turned slightly to see Daniel standing a few feet away, his expression no longer confused, no longer searching but quiet, as if he had finally stopped trying to reconcile and had begun to accept instead. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there are moments that do not require immediate words, only presence, only the acknowledgement of what has shifted between two people who once understood each other without effort. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice steady but lower than before, and I regarded him carefully, not with judgment, not with forgiveness either, but with clarity, because what he was saying was true in one sense, but incomplete in another, and I answered simply, "You did not look," and the distinction settled between us not as blame but as truth, and he nodded slightly, absorbing it without resistance, because now there was no longer a need to defend, only to understand. He glanced back toward the building briefly, then back at me. "I cannot stay in there like nothing happened," he said, and there was a quiet resolve in his voice that had not been there before, not loud, not dramatic but real, and I inclined my head once, acknowledging the choice without guiding it, because this was no longer a decision I could or should make for him. "What happens now?" he asked, and I considered the question for a moment, not because I lacked an answer, but because I understood that the answer was not singular, it was layered, it extended beyond this night into everything that would follow, and I chose the simplest form of it. "That depends on what you choose to see from here on," I said, and he held my gaze, the weight of that responsibility settling into him in a way that could not be undone. From inside, Ashley's voice carried faintly through the open doors, sharp, controlled, calling his name, and he did not turn immediately. He did not rush back, and that pause, that small delay, spoke more clearly than anything else could have, because it marked the space between who he had been and who he might become. I stepped past him then, moving toward the waiting car at the end of the drive, the headlights casting a soft glow against the gravel, and as I reached for the door, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge the finality of the moment, because some endings do not arrive with closure, they arrive with clarity, and clarity is enough. As the car door closed behind me and the engine started, I allowed myself one last glance through the window, not at the building, not at the people inside, but at the space I was leaving behind, and I understood then, with a certainty that required no confirmation, that I was no longer part of that version of my life, not because I had been pushed out, but because I had chosen to step away from what no longer held truth. And as the car moved forward, carrying me down the quiet road and away from the lights, I felt no anger, no regret, only the steady, unmistakable sense that everything had changed, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments that had finally revealed themselves all at once, and that from this point on, nothing that had been hidden would remain so again.